The moving van pulled away, its diesel grumble fading into the unnervingly perfect silence of Hollow's End. Jake and Maria Thompson stood side by side on the immaculate flagstone path, staring up at their new home. It was a beautiful two-story colonial, painted a tasteful whisper gray, with crisp white trim and a lush, emerald green lawn that looked like it had been trimmed with nail scissors. Every house on Serenity Circle was a variation of the same theme, each lawn a perfect rectangle of grass, each mailbox a polished brass replica of the next, each blossom in the flowerbeds looking vibrant and deliberately placed. There were no toys on the lawns, no stray leaves on the streets, no power lines marring the clear blue sky. It was, as the real estate agent had gushed, paradise. A master-planned community where everything was taken care of. For Jake, a graphic designer who craved order after a chaotic childhood, it was a dream come true. For Maria, a botanist with a love for wild, untamed things, it felt like a very beautiful, very clean cage. "It's so quiet," Maria whispered, the sound of her voice seeming to violate some unspoken rule. Jake squeezed her hand. "That's the point, honey. Peace. Quiet. A fresh start." He breathed in the air, which smelled faintly of cut grass and, underneath it, something else, something almost chemically clean. The fresh start was more than a cliché. It was a necessity. The miscarriage 6 months ago had left cracks in their marriage, a shared grief that manifested as silence and missed connections. Hollow's End, with its promise of structure and community, was the plaster they were using to fill those cracks. As they carried a box inside, a silver sedan, so clean it seemed liquid, pulled up to the curb. A man and a woman got out. They were both dressed in khakis and blue polo shirts, their smiles identical and unwavering. "Welcome to Hollow's End. I'm Carol, and this is my husband, Robert," the woman said, her voice a smooth, practiced instrument. "We're the welcoming committee, and also your neighbors from right across the street." Robert thrust a thick, leather-bound binder into Jake's hands. "The covenants, conditions, and restrictions," he said, his smile not touching his eyes. "The CC and RS. It's vital you read these tonight. The HOA takes the preservation of our community's character very seriously." Maria forced a smile. "Of course. We'll look through it." Carol's gaze swept over them, lingering for a moment on Maria's chipped nail polish. "You'll find everything you need to know in there. Lawn maintenance schedules, approved paint colors, noise ordinances, it's all for everyone's benefit. To keep things harmonious." Their smiles never faltered as they retreated to their car, leaving Jake and Maria standing on the porch with the heavy binder. Inside, the house was a blank canvas of beige walls and new carpet. As the sun set, casting long, perfect shadows across the identical lawns, Maria felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. She walked to the large bay window in the living room and looked out. Up and down the street, she saw their new neighbors. Some were watering their lawns with precise, measured motions. Others were simply standing on their porches, silhouetted against the fading light. Not talking, not moving. Just standing. And watching. It was then she noticed the absolute uniformity of the twilight. Not a single house had its interior lights on yet. As if on a hidden cue, at the exact moment the streetlights flickered on with a soft hum, every single house on Serenity Circle lit up in unison. Maria took a step back from the window, her heart thudding strangely in her chest. It was just a coincidence, she told herself. A community that valued punctuality. But the feeling of being a specimen under a microscope had already taken root, and in the perfectly manicured soil of Hollow's End, it would grow quickly. That night, they skimmed the binder. The rules were exhaustive and bizarrely specific. Grass was to be maintained at exactly 2 3/4 inches. No vehicle older than 5 years was to be parked in a driveway overnight. Holiday decorations were restricted to a 2-week period and required pre-approval by the HOA board. The list went on, but it was the final section, titled Article 12, Violations and Recompense, that was most strange. It stated that fines for violations were not monetary. It simply read, "The HOA ensures balance. All debts are settled in kind." Jake laughed it off. Probably just legalese. They probably just put a lien on your house or something if you don't pay a fee. Don't worry about it. He closed the binder, the thud of the cover sounding final. Maria wasn't so sure. The wording was ominous. Settled in kind. The next morning, a Saturday, Maria decided to start on the garden in the backyard. It was a small, fenced-in area that held the most potential for her. In the center was a beautiful, mature rose bush, its buds just beginning to show color. It was the one thing that felt established, something with a history. She spent the morning lovingly weeding and fertilizing it, her hands in the dirt a comforting, familiar sensation. On Monday, life began. Jake set up his home office, and Maria started researching local nurseries. On Tuesday, they received their first notice. It was a crisp, cream-colored card slipped into their mailbox. It had no stamp, no return address. It read, Violation, CC&R 4.15b. Lawn height measured at 3 1/4 inches. Recompense is pending. Jake crumpled the note. Are you kidding me? They measured our grass. It's been 2 days. He stormed outside with the lawnmower, muttering about busybodies. Maria felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. Recompense is pending. That evening, she went out to check on her rose bush. She stopped dead in her tracks. The bush, which had been vibrant and healthy that morning, was now sickly. Its leaves were spotted with yellow, and the promising buds had withered to brown, dry husks. It looked like it had been struck by a sudden, vicious blight. But the rest of the garden was perfectly fine. It was just the roses. The thing she had loved and cared for most. A cold dread, sharp and entirely irrational, trickled down her spine. She looked up at the surrounding houses. In an upstairs window of Carol and Robert's house, a curtain twitched shut. Settled in kind. The rose bush was dead. Not just sick, but completely, utterly lifeless, its canes brittle and grey as bone. Maria stood over it, a hollow feeling in her chest. She had called a garden center, describing the symptoms, and they were baffled. Sounds like rose blight, but it doesn't work that fast. Overnight. Impossible. It wasn't impossible. It had happened. Jake, trying to be pragmatic, suggested they just dig it up and plant a new one, but to Maria, it felt like a violation. It felt like a warning. The perfect silence of Hollow's End was no longer peaceful, it was watchful. The neighbors, with their placid smiles and synchronized lives, now seemed less like a community and more like a uniformed guard. A few days later, the second violation arrived. This one was for a non-conforming trash receptacle. Their simple black trash can was deemed aesthetically disruptive. The approved model, the note informed them, was the Tota Heritage model in Hunter Green, available at one specific store 40 minutes away. This is insane, Jake fumed, pacing the living room. Who cares what our garbage can looks like? Just get it, Jake, Maria said, her voice weary. She was staring out the window at the dead rose bush. Let's just not give them a reason. The argument that followed was their first real fight since moving in. It was sharp and loud, fueled by the unspoken grief they had carried with them and the new, oppressive pressure of their environment. Jake yelled about the cost and the principle. Maria screamed back that she couldn't stand the feeling of being constantly judged. They went to bed angry, a cold space between them in the king-sized bed. The next morning, a Saturday, they woke to a third violation notice. This one was different. It was a formal, typed letter on heavy cardstock. Violation, CC&R 12.7a. Audible disturbance. Unacceptable decibel levels detected between 9:47 p.m. and 10:13 p.m. Recompense is pending. They had been arguing. Someone had been listening. Or something had. The method of detection wasn't specified. The letter was slipped under their door. Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. This was beyond nosy neighbors. This was surveillance. That's it, he said, his face pale. I'm going to the HOA board. This is harassment. Maria begged him not to. The memory of the dead roses was too vivid. But Jake was a man of action, and feeling powerless was his personal hell. He stormed out of the house and drove to the community clubhouse, which served as the HOA headquarters. He returned an hour later, looking shaken. Well? Maria asked, her arms crossed. It was weird, he said, sinking into a kitchen chair. The board members, 3 of them, were just sitting at a table. They didn't speak. They just looked at me. I laid it all out: the grass, the trash can, the noise complaint. I told them it felt invasive. He ran a hand through his hair. When I finished, the man in the middle, an old guy named Mr. Sterling, just slid a single sheet of paper across the table. It was a copy of the original CC and RS, with one line highlighted in yellow: the HOA ensures balance. All debts are settled in kind. Then he smiled, and it was the emptiest smile I've ever seen. They didn't say a single word. Later that day, the consequences began. For Jake, it was a string of bad luck so mundane it was sinister. His favorite coffee mug slipped from his hand and shattered on the kitchen floor. His computer, containing a week's worth of work for a major client, crashed irrecoverably. Then he got the email: the client was terminating their contract, citing creative differences. For Maria, it was more visceral. She found that she couldn't remember the name of her favorite childhood teacher. Then, the scent of her mother's perfume, a distinct memory she cherished, simply vanished from her mind. It was gone, as if the file had been deleted. The violations weren't taking their money, they were taking their luck and their memories. Settled in kind. The noise violation was costing them pieces of their past. The final straw came that evening. A man appeared at their door. He was dressed in the now familiar khaki and polo uniform, his smile benign and plastic. He didn't introduce himself. He simply held a digital decibel meter. "Just a routine compliance check," he said, his voice a monotone. He didn't come inside. He just stood on the porch, the meter held out, as Jake and Maria stood frozen in their own hallway. He was measuring the sound of their existence, the sound of their breathing, the sound of their terror. After 5 minutes of unbearable silence, he looked at the reading, gave a slight, satisfied nod, and walked away without another word. That night, they huddled together on the couch, the silence of the house screaming in their ears. They were trapped. The HOA of Hollow's End wasn't just enforcing rules, it was feeding on them. And they had just been served their first course. The silence in the house was no longer empty, it was pregnant with threat. Every creak of the floorboards, every hum of the refrigerator felt like a prelude to another violation. Jake and Maria moved through their own home like ghosts, speaking in hushed tones, afraid that even the sound of their grief would be measured and found excessive. The loss of Maria's memories felt like a physical amputation. She would stare at old photographs, recognizing faces but unable to recall the stories behind them, a fog of absence where vivid emotion should be. Jake's professional life was in tatters, his confidence shattered by the inexplicable bad luck that seemed to dog his every move. They were being pared down, simplified, their rough edges sanded away to fit the seamless, sterile mold of Hollow's End. Desperation drove them to the only other people who might understand, their immediate neighbors, the Millers. They were a younger couple, with a quiet, 7-year-old daughter named Lily. Maria approached them cautiously at the community mailbox, her voice a whisper. "The violations, the roses, is it just us?" Mrs. Miller's face, usually a mask of placid contentment, fractured for a single, terrifying second. Her eyes darted around before she leaned in, her voice barely audible. "The balance. It always takes what you love most first." For us, it was Lily's voice. She looked down at her daughter, who was staring blankly at a perfectly manicured shrub. She used to sing. All the time. She had a violation for unapproved auditory emission during quiet hours. She hummed in her sleep. Now, she doesn't make a sound. The horror of it washed over Maria. They were stealing a child's voice. The Millers hurried away, their fear a palpable cloud around them. That night, Jake, driven by a frantic need for answers, went down a digital rabbit hole. He used a VPN to mask his activity and searched for any information on Hollow's End, its founders, and the strange phrase "settled in kind." He found almost nothing. The community had no online presence, no social media groups. It was a black hole. But in the deep web, on a forgotten urban exploration forum, he found a single, decade-old post. The user described Hollow's End as a sinkhole for misfortune, Theorizing it was built on a convergence of ley lines where an old land pact was made. The post ended abruptly. They don't want your money. They want your luck, your memories, your joy. They feed the land. The HOA are the priests. The rules are the ritual. Get out. The post was followed by a single reply from a different user, its text bold and red, the balance has been noted. The user had never posted again. Jake slammed his laptop shut, his heart pounding. It was all true. They were living on an altar, and they were the sacrifice. The final violation notice came the next day. It was the most severe yet, delivered by Carol herself. Her smile was razor-sharp. "It has come to our attention," she said, her voice syrupy with faux sympathy, "that you are expecting a child." Maria froze, her hand instinctively flying to her stomach. They had only just found out themselves. They hadn't told a soul. Article 14, subsection 2, Carol continued, her eyes gleaming. "All new additions to a household, human or otherwise, must be pre-approved by the HOA board. Your application was not submitted. This is a severe infraction. The recompense will be significant." She turned and walked back to her house, leaving them standing in the doorway, paralyzed with a terror so profound it was a physical weight. The baby. Their hope. The one thing that was supposed to be their new beginning. The HOA was claiming it as a debt. That was the breaking point. The fear crystallized into a desperate, furious resolve. They weren't going to wait for their child to be taken. They were going to fight. Jake remembered the urban explorer's words, "The rules are the ritual." If that was true, then the rulebook itself was the key. He grabbed the heavy CC&R binder. He didn't read it as a legal document, he read it as a grimoire. And in the fine print of Article 12, he found it. A clause so obscure it was almost hidden. In the event of a dispute regarding the nature of recompense, a petitioner may appeal directly to the source, at the stone circle in the Heartwood, during the waning moon. The waning moon was tonight. The Heartwood was the ancient, preserved forest at the very center of the Hollow's End development, a place the rules strictly forbade anyone from entering. It wasn't a community park, it was the sanctum sanctorum. They had their path. As full darkness fell, they prepared. They filled a backpack with a flashlight, a knife, and the CC&R binder. They were going to break the ultimate rule. They were going into the Heartwood to confront the source. Slipping out their back gate, they moved through the shadows between the perfect houses, feeling 1,000 unseen eyes upon them. The air grew colder as they approached the tree line. The forest was a wall of darkness, a stark, breathing contrast to the sterile order of the community. Taking a deep breath, holding each other's hands, they crossed the threshold and were swallowed by the ancient woods. The Heartwood was a different world. The perfectly paved paths ended abruptly, replaced by gnarled roots and soft, decaying leaves. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and old growth, a welcome relief from the chemical clean scent of the community. The silence here was natural, broken by the rustle of unseen creatures and the sigh of the wind in the tall pines. Using the flashlight sparingly, they pushed deeper, the sounds of Hollow's End fading completely behind them. The further they went, the more the world seemed to warp. The trees grew stranger, their trunks twisted into agonized shapes, their branches intertwining to form a canopy that blocked out the sliver of the waning moon. After what felt like an hour, they found it. A clearing. In its center stood a circle of standing stones, worn smooth by centuries. They were not natural, they had been placed there. In the middle of the circle was a flat, altar-like stone, and on it sat a large, open ledger, its pages appearing ancient and new all at once. Carved into the altar was the same symbol that was on the cover of their CC&R binder, a balanced scale, but one side of the scale was filled with abstract icons of houses, trees, and people, while the other side was empty. This was the balance. As they stepped into the stone circle, the temperature plummeted. The shadows around the clearing deepened, coalescing into forms. One by one, the members of the HOA board emerged from the darkness, their khakis and polo shirts looking absurdly out of place. They were led by Mr. Sterling. Their faces were no longer placid, they were etched with a grim, ancient hunger. "You have come to the source," Mr. Sterling said, his voice echoing with a power that didn't seem to come from his frail body. You wish to appeal your recompense. We want out, Jake said, his voice shaking but firm. He held up the binder. We reject your balance. We reject your rules. Mr. Sterling smiled, a thin, cruel gesture. The pact is older than this nation. The land here is hungry. It demands order. It consumes chaos. Your strife, your grief, your nonconformity, it is a feast for us. Your child represents future chaos, future imbalance. It is the perfect recompense. Maria stepped forward, her fear burning away in the furnace of her fury. You can't have my child. You've taken enough. You took my memories. You took that little girl's voice. We take only what is owed, another board member hissed. The land must be fed. We, the custodians, ensure it. Your modern lives are so full of messy, delicious energy. We simply harvest it. Jake realized the truth. The HOA wasn't just enforcing rules, they were feeding a parasitic entity, the land itself, and in return, they were granted their perfect, orderly, ageless existence. The CC and RS were a harvesting manual. He looked down at the open ledger on the altar. In the moonlight, he could see names. The Millers. Their own. Next to each name were lists of what had been taken: vocal creativity, child; memory, maternal scent, spouse; professional creative drive, head of household. And next to their names, newly inscribed, progeny, pending. It was a balance sheet of souls. The appeal, Jake said, his mind racing. The clause says we can appeal to the source. We're not appealing to you. We're appealing to it. He pointed at the altar. He threw the binder onto the stone ledger. We offer a new balance. You feed on chaos and disorder, right? You thrive on the energy of broken rules. So here it is. He took Maria's hand. We hereby renounce all the rules. Every single one. We choose chaos. We choose our messy, imperfect lives. And we're not the only ones. He turned and shouted into the dark woods, his voice ringing with a defiance that shattered the ritual silence. Everyone in Hollow's End. They feed on your fear. They take what you love. The rules are the chains. The HOA board members recoiled as if struck. The air began to vibrate. A low groan emanated from the earth beneath their feet. The entity, the source, was stirring. It had been offered a new, more potent energy, direct, conscious rebellion. The carefully managed system of minor violations was being shattered by a single, massive act of noncompliance. Stop him! Mr. Sterling shrieked, his face contorting. But it was too late. The ground trembled. The perfectly maintained order of Hollow's End began to crack. In the distance, they heard a car alarm blare, a sound never before heard in the community. A dog barked. A light flickered on in a house, then another, at random, unsynchronized times. The balance was breaking. The HOA members clutched their heads, writhing as the chaotic energy they had spent centuries controlling now flooded back into the land, into them. Their forms flickered, aging rapidly, their pristine clothes rotting to dust in moments. The land was rejecting its custodians. The ledger on the altar burst into cold, green flames, the pages blackening and turning to ash. Jake and Maria ran, stumbling out of the heartwood as the stone circle cracked and the ancient trees groaned. They didn't stop until they reached their house. The following days were a blur. Hollow's End was in chaos, but it was a beautiful, human chaos. Lawns went unmowed. A bright pink tricycle appeared on a lawn. People talked loudly on their porches, their voices unmodulated. The spell was broken. The Thompsons stayed. They were no longer prisoners, they were pioneers. Maria planted a new garden, a wild, untamed mix of flowers that would have given the old HOA a collective aneurysm. Jake's creativity returned in a flood, his work better than ever. The oppressive silence was gone, replaced by the glorious, unpredictable noise of life. Their daughter was born 6 months later, in the spring, with a full head of hair and a cry that was the loudest, most wonderful sound they had ever heard. They named her Hope. Sometimes, on the very edge of hearing, Maria could swear she detected a faint, satisfied sigh in the wind, as if the land, finally free of its hungry, orderly masters, was at last content to simply be.